Claude responded. They call me Grandpa, but that's not the story. They call me Grandpa, but that's not the story. My name is Walter Grayson, and I built something over 40 years that none of them ever saw coming. I am 64 years old. I drive a 2008 Ford Ranger with a bad tailgate latch and a bench seat that has molded itself to the exact shape of my back over the last 17 years. It used to be red. Now it's the color a truck gets when it has spent 2 decades parked under a maple tree that sheds sap every spring and doesn't apologize for it. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, work boots that I resole instead of replace, and a watch my late wife Doreen gave me in 1994 that keeps time about 6 minutes slow, and always has. I live in the house I built with my own hands on 11 acres outside a small town called Millbrook, where the feed store still opens at 6 and closes whenever Dwayne feels like locking up. My neighbor, Roy Fenwick, raises chickens and terrible opinions about the county commissioners in roughly equal measure, and every Sunday he leans on my fence and tells me I could afford a nicer truck. I tell him this one still starts. He laughs. I laugh. We talk about his rooster problem for 20 minutes, and I go back to my workshop. Here is what Roy doesn't know. Here is what the men at the diner counter don't know. What the woman who runs the hardware store and calls me Han every single time doesn't know. What the loan officer at the bank, who once asked if I needed help understanding the term collateral, absolutely did not know. I own Grayson Industrial Holdings. Manufacturing, commercial construction, a logistics arm, and a controlling stake in 11 regional companies, stitched together through a structure so deliberately unglamorous that my name has never once appeared in a business journal, a Chamber of Commerce newsletter, or a ribbon-cutting photo. I built it that way on purpose, brick by brick, contract by contract. 40 years of getting up at 4:45 in the morning and never once mistaking attention for accomplishment. Grayson Industrial Holdings is worth $2.4 billion. I drive a truck with 214,000 miles on it and a check engine light I've chosen to interpret as a personality trait, and I wouldn't trade a single thing about that. Now let me tell you about my granddaughter. Ivy Grayson is 29 years old, and she is, without a shred of exaggeration, the best thing that ever came out of this family. Sharp as a tack, kinder than she has any obligation to be, with a laugh that starts as a snort and turns into something that fills up a whole room before she can stop it. When she was 8, she talked her way into an extra hour of screen time using an argument so airtight I still bring it up at Thanksgiving. I remember thinking, this one's going to run something someday. I was right about that. What I did not expect was who she was going to marry. 2 years ago, Ivy brought home a man named Bradley Coulter. Now, I want to be fair to Bradley. I want to give him his due, because I am not a man who rushes to judge, so let me say it as generously as I can. Bradley Coulter is the human equivalent of a car alarm that goes off in an empty parking lot at 2 in the morning, impossible to ignore, and ultimately about nothing. He's 36, tall, the kind of handsome that requires a great deal of upkeep and wants you to notice the upkeep. He wears loafers with no socks in weather that doesn't call for it, drives a leased German sedan he refers to by its model number, and has a habit of steering every single conversation back to something he built, something he closed, or somewhere impressive he recently flew business class to. Within 20 minutes of meeting me, he mentioned his Wharton MBA, his handicap at a golf club I'd never heard of, and a strategic offsite in Austin. He said it the way people say the name of a city when they need you to know they've been there. I nodded and said, well, isn't that something? 8 months after meeting Ivy, Bradley Coulter was named president of Coulter Danvers Regional Freight. Here's where it gets interesting. So stay with me, because this part matters. Coulter Danvers is one of Grayson Industrial's subsidiaries, a solid outfit, 380 employees, contracts hauling freight for half the manufacturers in 3 states. Bradley got that job through what looked, from the outside, like a completely ordinary executive search. Headhunter, 4 rounds of interviews, background checks, a board vote, clean as a whistle, on paper. What nobody knew, what Bradley specifically did not know, and still doesn't know to this day, is that I personally controlled every stage of that process, from the first resume screen to the final signature. I sat in on his interviews through a screen in a back office. I read every reference call transcript. I reviewed the board's evaluation memo line by line. I approved his salary. I signed the paperwork. Then I drove home, changed into my work clothes, and spent the afternoon replacing a busted sprinkler head in the garden. Bradley texted me that night. Big news, Walter. Landed the president role at Coulter Danvers. Ivy's over the moon. I typed back, proud of you, son. You earned it. Then I set my phone on the counter and went to check on the tomatoes. I want to be honest about something. At the start, I genuinely wanted to give Bradley a fair shot. I've hired enough people in my life to know a first impression isn't the whole picture. People surprise you sometimes. Bradley did not surprise me. What he did instead was show me, slow and steady, exactly who he was. It started small, the way it always does. Then came the company holiday party, his company. He believed where he introduced me to a junior VP with too much cologne, who asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Bradley jumped in. Oh, he's retired. Ivy's grandpa. Sweet old guy. And just like that, I was steered toward the shrimp table like a man who'd wandered somewhere he didn't belong. I smiled. I ate a shrimp. I filed it away. But the moment that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 months ago. I'd stopped by the Coulter Danvers warehouse office to handle something quietly through one of my regional managers, the way I do a couple times a year, unremarkable, an old man in a flannel shirt nobody looks at twice. Walking past the break room, I heard Bradley's voice through the half-open door, talking to one of the dispatch supervisors. Ivy's grandfather, he was saying, and I could hear him grinning, harmless old guy. I think he ran a hardware store or something back in the day. Now he just fixes his fence and drives that busted truck. He lowered his voice, but not far enough. Ivy feels like she has to check in on him constantly, which, is a whole thing, but what are you gonna do? Family's family. I straightened my collar and walked quietly back the way I'd come. Harmless old guy, that busted truck. I let those words sit with me for 5 months. I come from patient people. My father used to say, Walter, the creek doesn't argue with the boulder. It just keeps flowing. And one day the boulder's gone. I kept flowing. If you've stuck with me this far, do me one small favor. Hit subscribe. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it means more than you'd guess. Thank you, truly. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday evening. Ivy called me sounding bright and easy, the way she always does. Bradley's parents, Donald and Patrice Coulter, wanted to host a family dinner at their place out in Cedar Hollow Estates. Donald was a retired hedge fund manager with Patrice was the kind of woman whose whole personality had been built around the square footage of her kitchen island. They wanted everybody together, one big, happy family. Grandpa, you're gonna love them, Ivy said. They're really warm people. I bet they are, sweetheart, I said. I already knew a few things about Donald and Patrice Coulter that would have made that sentence a lot harder for Ivy to finish. I said none of it. I told her I'd be there. I told her I was looking forward to it. Then Bradley called. Direct call, which was unusual enough on its own to be interesting. Friendly, casual, the tone people use right before they say something they know is a little insulting but have decided to say anyway. Hey, so, quick heads up about Saturday, he said. Donald and Patrice, they're pretty traditional. Old school, Might be worth, maybe dressing up a touch. Nothing crazy. Just something a little sharper than the usual flannel. There was a pause. Bradley, I said, pleasant as could be, I appreciate you thinking of me. Of course, he said, relieved. Just want everybody comfortable. You know how it is. I do, I said. See you Saturday. I hung up. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror for a good long moment. Then I went to my closet, past the 2 suits in the back, the navy one, the charcoal one, the one I wore when Grayson Industrial closed its biggest acquisition 9 years back, past all of it, and pulled out my plainest flannel and my cleanest pair of work jeans. I laid them out for Saturday. Then I walked out to the driveway, patted the hood of the old Ranger twice, the way you'd pat the shoulder of somebody you trust before something important. We've got a dinner, old girl, I thought. Dress code's humble. We've got that covered. Because here's what Bradley Coulter didn't understand. Here's what Donald and Patrice didn't understand. Here's what nobody at that table was going to understand until it was much too late. I wasn't dressing down because it was all I had. I was dressing down because I wanted to see exactly who they were when they thought nothing was riding on it. And I had a feeling quiet, certain 40 years in the making that they were about to show me everything. Saturday came the way important days always do. Quiet, no fanfare, no idea what it was about to become. I woke at 4:45 like I have for 4 decades, made my coffee black, sat at my kitchen table by the window looking out over the garden, and watched the morning come in slow and gray over the maple tree. I was calm. I'm always calm. It's the most underrated tool a man can carry. I dressed slow and deliberate. Clean jeans, a plain button-down, my everyday boots, polished but nothing special. No watch worth mentioning besides Doreen's, which I wore anyway, because some things you don't hide for anybody. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, yes, that's exactly right. I walked out to the truck. The Ranger sat there in the morning light, faded red and unbothered, the dented tailgate catching a sliver of early sun. I got in. The engine turned over with its usual complaint, then settled into a rattle I've come to find almost comforting. Let's go see who these people are, I thought, and I drove to Cedar Hollow. The Coulter place sat at the end of a long private drive lined with hedges trimmed with the kind of aggressive precision that sends a specific message to anybody arriving. We are people who control things, even the shrubbery. I pulled the Ranger up to the circle drive. A young man stood near the entrance, not quite a valet, not quite security, whose whole job seemed to be making arriving guests feel either welcomed or measured, depending on what they drove. He looked at the truck, then at me, then back at the truck, with the specific expression of a man doing rapid, unflattering math. "Evening, sir," he said, recovering fast. "I can park that for you." "Much obliged, son," I said, handing him the keys. "She pulls a little right. Don't let it worry you." He nodded with the focused look of a man trying hard not to have any more feelings about the vehicle he'd just been handed. I straightened my shirt and walked to the door. Donald Coulter opened it before I could knock. Tall man, 71, silver hair, the kind of build that had commanded rooms most of his life without much effort. Dressed in that particular way rich men dress at-home clothes that cost more than a suit but are cut to look relaxed. His smile was warm and practiced, assembled rather than felt. "Walter," he said, hand out. "So glad you could make it. Come in, come in." The handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to, not a second more. I noticed. The house was everything the driveway promised: vaulted ceilings, art chosen to impress rather than love, a staircase that curved up with the quiet confidence of something used to being admired. Every surface said the same thing: we have always had this. Patrice Coulter appeared from the sitting room, elegant in the assembled, precise way of women who consider every detail before it leaves the house. Her jewelry was understated in the specific way that only very expensive jewelry manages to be, which is to say, not understated at all. "Walter," she said, taking both my hands like she wanted the contact to stand in for sincerity. "We've heard so much about you. You're just as sweet as Ivy said." Sweet. There it was. First word out of her mouth. Not sharp, not accomplished, not interesting. Sweet. The word people reach for with golden retrievers and elderly relatives who've stopped following the conversation. "Thank you, Patrice," I said warmly. "Beautiful home you've got." She beamed. People who build their identity around their possessions never tire of hearing the possessions praised. Ivy crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was 3. I held that hug a beat longer than usual. "You look good, Grandpa," she whispered. "So do you, sweetheart," I said. Bradley appeared behind her, looked at my outfit, and controlled his face fast, but not fast enough. A flicker, half a second, that said I specifically asked him to dress up, followed by the recovery smile. "Walter, glad you made it," he said, clapping my shoulder the way men do when they're performing warmth for an audience. "Come on in, Donald opened something special." Something special. That turned out to be the whole theme of the evening. The wine, the food, the house, the family, all of it special. Everything except me. We moved to the dining room. Table set with the kind of deliberate formality that takes hours to arrange and is specifically built to make certain guests feel the gap between themselves and their hosts. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, looked around at the people who'd invited me into their home, and made myself invisible. Not because they did it to me, because I chose it. I've spent 64 years learning that the most dangerous thing a man can do in a room full of people underestimating him is correct that mistake too soon. So I sat, I smiled, I asked polite questions. I complimented wine I hadn't tasted yet, and I watched. Donald led the conversation the way men like Donald always do, loud, from the front, with the total confidence of a man who's never once been told he talks too much. Markets, a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast, Bradley's extraordinary instincts running Coulter Danvers. The boys completely turned that operation around, Donald said, swirling his glass. The board respects him enormously. Leadership's in the blood, I think. He glanced my way, just informative enough to draw a contrast without saying it out loud. I nodded appreciatively. That's wonderful, I said. You must be very proud. Then Patrice turned to Ivy with a smile that had a very specific shape. And Ivy, you must feel so secure having a husband who provides so well. Not every girl gets that. The table went quiet for half a second. Ivy smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I saw them. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and said nothing, because the envelope hadn't arrived yet, and I knew, with the quiet certainty of a patient man, that when it did, everything at that table was about to change. There's a moment in every long game where patience stops being a virtue and turns into a verdict. That moment showed up with dessert. I'd been at that table 2 hours of nodding, 2 hours of smiling, 2 hours of asking questions I already knew the answers to and laughing at Donald's stories, which weren't as funny as Donald believed. I'd played my part flawlessly. The sweet old grandpa, Ivy's harmless relative with the busted truck who probably ran a hardware store back in the day. I wore that role all evening like a comfortable jacket, and not one soul at that table suspected there was anything else underneath it. Then Donald reached under his chair, and I felt that quiet internal shift I've learned to recognize over 4 decades, the shift where a thing you've been waiting for finally shows up. He set a leather folder on the table, smoothed it once with his palm, and slid it across to me. Walter, Donald said, voice dropping into the measured register of a man who's rehearsed this. There's something we'd like to discuss as a family. I looked at the folder, didn't touch it yet. Patrice's hands were folded on the table. Bradley had straightened up with the posture of a man trying to look casual about something he was not casual about at all. Ivy glanced at me, quick and uncertain, then back at her father-in-law. I looked at her hands in her lap. They weren't still. Bradley's got a vision, Donald continued. A real one. His own logistics tech venture, built from the ground up. The kind of opportunity that comes once in a man's life. We believe in him completely. As you should, I said. What we need is startup capital, Donald said. And what we're proposing, he nodded at the folder, is a straightforward arrangement. Ivy's trust fund, used as collateral to secure the initial round, fully legal, drawn up properly, above board in every respect. He leaned forward. We just need your blessing, Walter, as her grandfather. He looked at me, then at Patrice, whose smile had the fixed quality of something applied rather than felt, then at Bradley, calm and certain, already mentally spending money he'd decided was his. And I thought, you have no idea whose table you're sitting at. I picked up the folder, opened it, read every page slow and deliberate while the candles flickered and nobody dared say a word. I read every carefully worded clause, every number. Then I closed it, set it gently back down, picked up my water glass, took an unhurried sip, and looked at Donald Coulter with the warmest smile I own. I appreciate the thought that went into this, I said pleasantly. I'll look it over carefully. Donald exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath an hour. Bradley's shoulders dropped half an inch. Patrice reached for her wine with the relieved energy of a woman who thinks the hard part's over. They thought they'd won. I finished my water, made pleasant conversation another 20 minutes, thanked Patrice for a lovely evening, shook Donald's hand, a full handshake this time, firm, my eyes on his, 1 second longer than necessary. He had no idea what that second meant. I walked out to the drive. The valet brought the Ranger around with the look of a man who'd spent the evening quietly judging that truck and had now made his peace with it. I tipped him more than he expected and watched his face change. I got in, the engine groaned, the AC rattled and thought better of it, and I drove home through the dark, quiet roads, calmer than I had any business being, given what I already knew I was about to do. I said nothing for 11 days. Not a word, not a flinch, not a single ripple on the surface of my life. I fixed Roy's fence gate on Tuesday, went to the feed store Thursday, drove the Ranger to church Sunday like always. On day 3, Bradley texted, "Hey Walter, just checking in. Did you get a chance to look at the proposal? Pretty exciting stuff, right?" I waited 2 hours, then wrote back, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. I set the phone down and made a call. Not to Bradley, not to Donald, to 3 specific men, senior board members at Coulter Danvers, who'd known me 20 years and understood that when I called directly, it wasn't a social occasion. "Run the audit," I said. "Full scope. Standard cycle. Start today." Then I hung up and went back out to the garden. Because here's what I knew that Bradley Coulter didn't. What Donald and Patrice, sitting in their estate in Cedar Hollow congratulating themselves over expensive wine, had no idea about. I'd written Bradley's employment contract myself, every clause, including one buried on page 11, a non-compete and fiduciary duty clause Bradley signed 2 years ago without reading it closely enough. A clause I'd drafted 12 years before Bradley Coulter ever showed up in my life. Built precisely for men who think they're smarter than the room they're standing in. I'd been patient 12 years. I could manage 11 more days. What the audit turned up took 9 days to fully document, and when the final report hit my desk, I sat with it a long while. Not because I was surprised. I wasn't. I sat with it because I wanted to be sure, completely sure, before I did what came next. Bradley had been building his logistics tech venture for 6 months, on company time, on company laptops, using Coulter Danvers' own client list and carrier contracts to construct a business designed to compete directly against Grayson Industrial, quietly, confidently, believing nobody above him was watching. He'd forgotten something I consider fundamental. You cannot build a thing in secret inside a house that belongs to the man you're hiding it from. Every meeting, every file, every contact made on the clock, all of it documented, all of it sitting in a folder on my desk on a Thursday morning when I put on the charcoal suit from the back of the closet, pressed the night before, and drove the Ranger to Coulter Danvers. I parked in the reserved spot out front, the one with a small plate that read Grayson Industrial Holdings. Reserved. The one Bradley had walked past 3 times a week for 2 years without once asking whose name was on it. I walked into the conference room and sat at the head of the table, board members to my left, legal counsel to my right, the audit findings in a folder in front of me, and in about 4 minutes, Bradley Coulter walked through that door, believing he was arriving for a routine check-in. I straightened my jacket. I waited. The door opened. He came in with his usual confidence worn like a coat, easy, natural. He scanned the room, took in the board members, the lawyers, the papers on the table, and then his eyes landed on me, sitting at his table, in his conference room, in a suit he'd never once seen me wear. I watched it move across his face in slow motion, floor by floor. The search process, the contract, the audit, Donald's proud toast, the folder sliding across the dinner table. Every moment of the last 2 years, arriving all at once on a Thursday morning. The silence held 10 full seconds. I let every one of them land. Then I said quietly, "Sit down, Bradley." He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said. "Not because I'm angry, I want you to hear that part. Anger's for men who didn't see it coming. I saw this coming the moment you handed me that off-site itinerary at my own kitchen counter 2 years ago." I opened the folder. Coulter Danvers is owned by Grayson Industrial. Grayson Industrial is owned by me, has been for 17 years. The title you carry, the salary you draw, the whole identity you've built around this office exists because I built the company underneath it. I signed off on you because I believed in what I saw. I gave you every resource a man could ask for. And for 6 months, You use those resources to build something meant to compete against the very foundation that made you. I closed the folder. The clause in your contract covers every item this audit found. Legal is prepared to take this all the way, if that's what you'd prefer. Every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, very young, very small, very far from Austin. However, I said, I've got no interest in destroying you. I'm interested in clarity. So here's what happens. You resign today, quiet, professional. Your name stays clean, and this stays inside these walls. Or we go the legal route, and everything in this folder becomes public record. He looked at the board members, neutral. He looked at the lawyers, neutral. He looked back at me, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not anger, not a man trying to talk his way out of its shame. The real, quiet kind. The kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clearly and doesn't like what's looking back. I'll resign, he said, quiet, like the words cost him something. Good, I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up my folder. At the door, I turned back. One more thing. That proposal your father put on the table at dinner Ivy's trust used as collateral. I let that sit exactly 1 second. My attorneys moved her trust this morning, directly into her name, irrevocable, an account that requires her signature alone. Your father's proposal is now a document about money that no longer exists where he thought it did. Tell your parents I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent. I drove home in the Ranger. The engine cleared its throat on the first try. The AC came on, thought about it, and gave up halfway down the block. The dented tailgate caught the last of the afternoon light as I turned onto my road and pulled into the drive. I sat there a moment. Just sat. 40 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing exactly who I was the whole time. I patted the dash once. Good girl, I thought. Then I went inside and called my granddaughter. She showed up 20 minutes later and found me at the old kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee already poured. She sat across from me and studied my face a long moment, the way she studied it since she was 3, reading it like a map she's known her whole life. I told her all of it, from the start, the company, the way it's structured, the Coulter Danvers appointment, the clause I wrote a dozen years ago, the audit, the boardroom, the trust transfer, every piece laid out quiet and plain. When I finished, Ivy sat silent a long while. Then she looked up and asked the only question that mattered, the one I'd been carrying the answer to for almost 30 years. Grandpa, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I looked down at my coffee, out at the dark garden, back at my granddaughter, at her mother's eyes in her face, at that laugh that fills up a room. Because I wanted you to choose your own life, I said, not have it chosen for you by what I own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company. I wanted you to see your grandfather. She cried. I held her hand across the table and let her. And I thought about Donald Coulter sitting very still in that big house out in Cedar Hollow. Patrice, setting down her wine. Bradley, trying to find the words to explain to his parents how the quiet old man in the flannel shirt turned out to be the one person at that table they should never, not for 1 second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that mattered in the whole world was sitting right across that table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, eyes red, smiling through it anyway. My granddaughter. The best thing I ever built. Some men don't look like much. They just are. And the ones who underestimate them always find out, sooner or later, whether they're ready or not. If this one got to you, do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one. Claude responded. Real worth was never allowed a day. In its life, it shows up in who fixes the fence, who keeps a promise nobody's watching, who lets someone else shine instead of. Real worth was never allowed a day in its life. It shows up in who fixes the fence, who keeps a promise nobody's watching, who lets someone else shine instead of grabbing the spotlight. Quiet doesn't mean small. So the next time somebody in old boots and a beat-up truck crosses your path, look twice. You might be standing next to more heart, and maybe more grit, than you'll ever find in a leather folder. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI purely for entertainment, and if a bit of warmth or a good lesson stayed with you along the way, that's the nicest bonus we could ask for.